So there's this show on Netflix that my Ryan and I have fallen in love with. And I had hoped to show you the trailer of it, but we were unsuccessful in appropriately bleeping it so that it could be a G-rated kind of clip. And I didn't realize quite how generationally specific maybe it was, except at 8:30, I realized that somewhere between 35 and 45 were the only people in the room who had any idea what I was talking about. There's a show on Netflix, it's called Ugly Delicious. Anybody ever seen this besides Mr. Steitz? He loves this show, y'all. He'll be glad to come over and watch it all. He'll binge it with you. It's called Ugly Delicious, and it's hosted by this chef named David Chang. And David Chang is a Beard Award-winning chef, and if you're not a foodie, you should know that that makes him a very, very big deal. And David travels all over the world with his friends and eats all this food with activists and writers and other chefs. And the whole idea of this show is to use it as a vehicle, to use food as a vehicle to break down cultural barriers and misconceptions and walls between peoples. And if I could show you this trailer, you would hear this renowned chef talk about how, quote, the dishes that we are making is about telling a story. How do you tell someone to be more open-minded? How do you tell someone to expand their world in a new way? He said, I try to do that with food. Another chef says, I want to be able to cook so that people might be able to understand me. I love this idea of telling story with food. We do it every Sunday, right? We tell story with food. One of my favorite stories out of this Ugly Delicious show, I loved it because it's one of my favorite places to eat in Los Angeles from when we lived there. It's actually a food truck, so you actually sit on a curb and your plate is the gutter. There's this truck called the Kogi truck, and it's so good, y'all. Oh my gosh, if you're ever in LA, you should find the Kogi truck. And it's so indicative of the neighborhood in which we lived. Because if you walk into a Korean restaurant and you see all the Hispanic line cooks, you can understand how the Kogi truck came to be. It's LA in a corn tortilla. So you go to the Kogi truck and they take Korean short ribs and they put them and make a taco out of it. And then they take kimchi and they put it in a flour tortilla and they make kimchi quesadillas. Yes, thank you. I just needed somebody to affirm my weird food eating habits. Oh my gosh, y'all, it is so good. But it is this mixture, and it's all God's children eating this food, and it doesn't make any sense to anybody unless you live in this neighborhood that we lived in LA. Well, unless you live in Kansas City, of course, because we tell story with food, right? There's a certain food group, one might say, that tells the story of Kansas City, right? And that would be, it is not vegan anything. Barbecue. You tell the story of this great city and her amazing people When people come to visit you for the first time, where do you take them? Oh, but did you hear that? It happened that same way at 8:30. Some people were saying different things. Except some of you said Arthur Bryant's. I heard Arthur Bryant's over here somewhere. Yes. But I also heard Gates over here somewhere. Joe's. Some people say Smokestack. LC's. I love LC's. LC's, it feels like Kansas City to me. What? Slaps. Okay, Slaps. I don't know that. That sounds like an outing to me, Mr. Steitz. That sounds like an outing. Oh, he says I've been. Okay. Now I'm distracted. So, we tell this story about who we are. It's ordinary food. It's kind of blue-collar food. Our city grew up around the stockyards and hardworking people, and we're a cow town, and we're not very fancy, or most of us aren't very fancy, and therefore you eat at places like LC's because it doesn't matter what you're wearing. Doesn't matter whether you got your hair brushed. Doesn't matter whether you've showered. Doesn't matter anything. You can go into LC's, and that old boy sitting in that half-broken chair is going to lean back and say, hey. Or you walk into someone else and they holler at you to take your order, right? They're just trying to move you along. Barbecue, wherever you eat it, is a story about who we are as Kansas Cityans. Regardless of which side of the river, regardless of which side of the state line, we all come around this table of mounds and mounds and mounds of beef and sauce. Some people in town, and I would never criticize barbecue in any way, but some people in town have tried to make barbecue fancy. That's a step too far for me. I just can't do it. It didn't feel fancy to me. I don't think barbecue should be fancy. But it's their story. And, so David Chang in this Ugly Delicious, he does this whole series, he does this whole episode on barbecue. We are not in it. Right? We are not in it. Shame. We're going to have to fix this at some point. But he reminds the viewer in one of the cooks, the pit cooks in, North Carolina or Memphis or one of those places that cook some other kind of barbecue. He says, barbecue means all kinds of things. The story we tell about it in Kansas City is not the same story they tell about it in Texas, and not the same story they tell about it in Memphis. And it's not the same story that they tell about it in the Carolinas, because that's just something entirely different. And then there's this that they make with mustard. I don't understand that at all. But David Chang challenges us to take it one step farther. He says, what about, because he's Korean, he says, what about Korean barbecue? Is that barbecue? Heck yeah, it's barbecue. You sit around this big table, and they have this cooker in the middle, and they just put big old slabs of meat, and they cook it right in front of you. It's so good. Now, if I told Suzanne, I've been helping Suzanne eat for many, many, many years. If I told Suzanne, when you come to LA, I'm going to take you to a Korean restaurant. Do you know what Suzanne would say? No. And no would be the kindest thing that she said to me. But if I said to Suzanne, honey, I'm going to take you to this barbecue joint over in Koreatown. Maybe, she says. Because that's a language she can understand. That's something she can get her head around. That says maybe we aren't so far apart as what we think we are. Food gives us sometimes a common language. But then David Chang goes on a little farther in this episode that excludes Kansas City from barbecue. And he says, what about Peking duck? You know how they cook Peking duck? Well, it's in this big old, it's sort of like cooking barbecue. You hang it, big old wood fire, and you close it all up, and you got to move the ducks from one to another. It's kind of that fancy kind of barbecue. But I don't have a beard award, but it seems like barbecue to me. Maybe we aren't so far apart when we come around food and the stories that we tell about food. Food tells a story of who we are. I don't know much about that barbecue they cook in North Carolina, but I know they love it. I know it's their story. I know that it says something about who they are and who they're trying to be in the world. I don't want to say that's not barbecue any more than I don't want them to say that what we eat, regardless of where we eat it, isn't barbecue either. Because that cuts to the core of who we are in this city. It's a story, regardless of whether it has ribs or burnt ends. Do you know there are barbecue places that don't serve burnt ends? Shame. You know, this is a similar story to what happens here in the 24th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. You're thinking, how is she going to take this from a barbecue joint to an Easter story? I got you. I started reading in the 24th chapter at verse 13. But if you go back to the 23rd chapter, do you know what you find? You find the death, the crucifixion, and the burial of Jesus. And then in the first few verses of chapter 24, you find the women going to an empty tomb. You find a few of the dudes going to an empty tomb. Do you know what you do not find in the first 12 verses of chapter 24? Jesus. You do not find Jesus. Just an empty tomb. Just confusion and disbelief and amazement. Probably a sense that the whole world has gone mad and they couldn't find any place to stand. And so we get to verse 13 and it's this anxious kind of day. It's a continuation of this very anxious day. It says, on that same day, 2 disciples were traveling to a village called Emmaus. I love what Frederick Buechner says about where Emmaus is. There's no real good record about where Emmaus is. And Buechner says something to the effect that Emmaus is the place where we go when it feels like our hope is on fire and we're not quite sure and the world feels crazy and there are bomb threats and crazy stuff and synagogue shootings and anxious elections and all of these things. You go to Emmaus. That's what Buechner sort of says. It's a place where you go when you're not quite sure what in the world is happening. And that's where these 2 disciples went. The rest, of course, were holed up in Jerusalem. And it says that this stranger comes along, this perhaps a hopeless wanderer. They must have assumed he wasn't from around here because they said, don't you have any idea what's going on? Don't you have any idea what's happening? And he comes along, and as the song says, he comes along to share their road. And they don't recognize who he is. The only time when it clicked was, he said, I'm going to go on. And they said, no, we're going to stay here. We're going to have a little dinner. And so Jesus stays and goes to the table and takes bread. I don't know whose house they were at. And he took bread and he blessed it and broke it. And he gave it to them. He took the bread, he blessed the bread, he broke the bread, he gave them the bread. There's a line in that song that the choir sang that says, and I remembered the words that he said. I remember the words that you said, right? Only then did they recognize. Only then. Not with the women, not with Peter, not even as these two had walked and talked with him did they make the connection. They'd been out wandering this road to Emmaus. They had felt a little hopeless, no doubt. We don't know what's going on. And when they gather around the table, the story begins to change. Suddenly, these two disciples had a new story. A story that would define the church up into this day. A story that we're going to explore over the next several weeks as we explore other table stories. A story that in the Acts book, every time they gather, they say, we gathered on the first day of the week, not to sing cool songs, not to hear the preacher blabber on past kickoff, but to come around the table and break bread together. That's what it says they gathered to do. They came to share one another, and in sharing one another, they hoped to find the risen Christ among them, in one another. This encounter at the table changes the whole narrative for the followers of Jesus. And so what do? They run back to the disciples. They were no longer walking. They were hope-filled with purpose. Headed back to the disciples as if to say, hold fast. Hold fast. What does the story of the table mean to you? For as many, we're going to look at 4 stories over the next 4 weeks, and each one says something a little bit different about what the table, what the meal might mean. How does this table make us unique? What story do we tell about why we gather at this table every week? Because there would be full-on revolt if I said, you know what? We're just going to go because it's about kickoff time and the Chiefs are about to start and Patrick Mahomes is going to do something cool while we're sitting here. And so we're just going to skip communion today. Right. Exactly. Shut it down, preacher, because we got to have communion. Why is that? Why is that? Hold fast. You know, sometimes we have to do it differently to really understand. At the 8:30 service, they were all gathered around tables. Not the regular neat little rows, but they were gathered around tables. Ooh. They weren't quite sure what to do with that. Tables? You mean my regular seat is not here? It's like when you go to North Carolina, you say, oh, well, this barbecue that my cousin Sue took me to is fine, but careful. That's somebody else's sacred story right there. It may not taste like home, but how does coming to their table and encountering their story help open you up that maybe, just maybe, your way may not be the only way? Ooh, there's a story 2 days before Tuesday. Maybe your barbecue is not the only barbecue to be eaten in the world. Maybe somebody else finds mustard sauce to be sacred food. Maybe Peking duck is really barbecue. It's probably much older. As the Wonder Boy says in the Ugly Delicious show, unless you invented fire, you do not get to define barbecue. Ooh. Wow. How does the table open us up to something bigger than ourselves? That we are not the center of the universe, that our way is not the only one. The Peking duck might be barbecue. Because if they like barbecue and we like barbecue, it might be a place to start a conversation. sitting in the gutter eating those Korean short rib tacos, that's a holy experience. When you stand in line over at Joe's, when the line is out the door and around the corner and over to Jim Miller's shop, right? It ends up over there in front of Jim's shop. And you're standing in line with your Chiefs shirt on, and the guy with the Broncos jersey comes up behind you. How do you tell the story of this table where everyone is welcome? That's a simple example about the Broncos jersey, but I actually kind of mean it. Since we beat them, we can. What story are we telling? Must we sit silently in our seats? Does it matter whether we use real bread? Does it matter that we use gluten-free because some among us need that? Will it make a mess all over the floor? Probably. Do you need the little chiclet wafers and a shot? Does it matter that we use grape juice rather than wine? What is the story that we tell from this table? Maybe at 8:30, with them sitting anxiously around their little tables, not quite sure what to do. The story is that we are a community of flexibility and being open to change and to trying new ways of being and seeing in the world. To say that we are not a church stuck in our own ways. To a world that is hungry for a different kind of faith community, hey, we got a pretty big table up in here. And we'd love to invite you to it. What does it say that everybody gets to come to the table? What does it say that we let lay folks serve and pray at the table? That's extraordinary, and we take it for granted. This table has so many stories that it invites us into. And yet so often in worship, we don't give it a whole lot of effort. You don't have to get up. You just sit there. It comes to you. Well, yes, chiclet, shot, yes. What's Jonathan playing? But the only way that the story got told in Luke 24 was because the disciples got up out of their seats and did something. That story never got told if they'd have stayed in their chair and kept quiet and confused. But they didn't. They said, there'll be no more hopeless wandering. I have a story to tell, a story that the world needs to hear. And they did not wander back to Jerusalem. They ran back to Jerusalem to tell their friends the story. So this morning, as you come forward for communion, if you are able, we're going to invite you to stand up after we sing our communion hymn and come forward to have an encounter with a human being, offering to you the gifts of love and hope, offering to you the gifts of story, of our story as people of faith. And so what story will you tell? Will you tell that story that, well, she ruined my private devotion time, my private quiet time? Well, we'll find another time for you to have your quiet time, I promise. When you get back to your seat, you can have some quiet. How do we engage with other humans? It makes us uncomfortable. It makes us anxious. It makes us uncertain. And the risen Christ says, I come alongside, I call you by name, and I share your road. And that is a story worth telling. May it be so. May it be so for us. Amen.